January 17, 1945, Northern Luzon, Philippines. The rain had stopped an hour before dawn. In the half-light, American soldiers of the 6th Army moved through abandoned Japanese positions near the village of San Fernando, their boots sinking into mud that smelled of cordite and decay. Among the shattered bunkers and overturned supply crates, they found something unexpected. Not weapons or maps, but women. 23 of them huddled in a windowless barracks that reeked of sweat, mildew, and fear. Their eyes, hollow and ancient in faces too young, stared without comprehension as medics draped blankets over skeletal shoulders. One girl, no more than 17, flinched when a sergeant extended his hand. She had learned that extended hands meant something else entirely. Within hours, these women would be transported to a field hospital 20 miles behind the front lines. They would be given clean beds with white sheets that smelled of soap. They would receive hot meals served on metal trays, portions so large they would stare in disbelief. And at night, for the first time in months or years, they would sleep in silence. No boots on floorboards, no doors sliding open, no whispered commands in the dark. This simple trinity of dignity, cleanliness, nourishment, and safety would shatter something fundamental in their understanding of what captivity could mean. They had been told by their captors that Americans were demons who would torture and mutilate them. They had been promised that surrender meant death worse than any they had already endured. They had been lied to about everything. The institution that had entrapped these women bore a bureaucratic euphemism that disguised its horror, ianjo, or comfort stations. Beginning in 1932, when the Imperial Japanese Army established the first such facility in Shanghai, and expanding dramatically after 1937 with the onset of full-scale war in China, the system eventually ensnared between 50,000 and 200,000 women across Asia and the Pacific. The vast majority were Korean, taken from a colonized nation that had no voice to protest. Others were Chinese, Filipino, Indonesian, Dutch, and Japanese. Poverty and occupation made them all vulnerable to the same machinery of coercion. The Japanese military command framed this system as a strategic necessity. After the rape of Nanking in 1937, where widespread sexual violence by Japanese soldiers sparked international condemnation and damaged military discipline, the General Staff concluded that regulated sexual slavery would be more orderly than random assault. Internal documents from the War Ministry's archive, declassified in the 1990s, reveal the clinical language of logistics, requirements for medical examinations, transportation schedules, ratios of women to soldiers. One memo from 1942 specified that comfort stations in the South Pacific should maintain one woman for every 30 enlisted men, with increased numbers near combat zones to maintain morale and prevent venereal disease. The women themselves were acquired through methods that ranged from outright kidnapping to calculated deception. In Korea, agents employed by the military promised young girls factory work in Japan or opportunities to train as nurses. They arrived at train stations with their families waving goodbye, clutching small suitcases packed with clothes they would never wear again. In occupied China and the Philippines, soldiers simply took women during village raids, documenting them as military supplies in requisition forms. A Japanese corporal named Yasuji Kaneko, interviewed decades later as part of war crimes investigations, recalled the matter-of-fact brutality. We were told they were necessary equipment, like ammunition or rations. We didn't think of them as people. The Army made sure we didn't. The conditions within comfort stations followed a grim uniformity across thousands of miles of conquered territory. Women were assigned numbers and false names. They lived in cramped wooden buildings divided into tiny cubicles, each barely large enough for a thin mattress on the floor. Daily quotas were enforced. On ordinary days, 10 to 30 soldiers per woman. On weekends or before major offensives, the numbers doubled or tripled. Medical examinations conducted by military physicians focused solely on detecting venereal disease, treating the women as vectors of infection rather than victims of systematic rape. Food was scarce and often spoiled. Water for washing was limited. Privacy did not exist. The psychological architecture of control relied on isolation and manufactured fear. Women were forbidden to speak their native languages to each other. Letters home, when permitted at all, were censored and scripted. Most devastating was the deliberate indoctrination about the enemy. Japanese soldiers and station managers repeatedly told the women that if Americans or Allied forces captured them, they would be tortured, raped more violently than the Japanese had done, and then murdered. This narrative was reinforced with gruesome stories and occasional evidence, photos of casualties from bombing raids, described as examples of American cruelty. The message was clear. The horror you know is better than the horror they will bring. For women trapped in this system, survival meant the death of hope. They developed 1,000 small strategies to endure, detaching their minds during the assaults, memorizing childhood songs in silence, finding fractional comfort in a shared glance with another woman who understood. But they did not imagine liberation. They imagined only continuation or death. When American forces began retaking Pacific Islands and Philippine territory in 1944 and early 1945, combat units encountered comfort stations irregularly. The military's primary focus was tactical advance, not social rescue. Initial responses varied. Some commanders recognized the women as victims and evacuated them to medical facilities, while others, confronted with language barriers and confused by the women's terror, simply left them behind as the front moved forward. It was not until clear protocols were established by General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters in late 1944 that a more consistent approach emerged. Treat them as displaced civilians, provide medical care, ensure security, and document their accounts. The field hospital near San Fernando, where the 23 women arrived that January morning, had been set up in a commandeered school building. Army nurses, most of them in their 20s and 30s, had treated thousands of wounded soldiers since landing in Leyte months earlier. They had seen shrapnel wounds, burns, malaria, psychological breakdowns, but nothing had prepared them for the condition of these women. Lieutenant Margaret Stevenson, a nurse from Iowa, whose letters home were later donated to the National Archives, wrote, "They were so thin I could count their ribs from across the room. Their hair was matted and full of lice. Many had infected wounds or sores that hadn't been treated. But worst was the fear. When we tried to help them undress for bathing, some of them started screaming. Others went completely blank, like they'd left their bodies." The transformation began with the simplest acts of care. Army medics set up canvas partition screens to provide privacy during medical examinations. Nurses heated water for baths, not cold buckets, but actual warm water in portable tubs. They brought soap that smelled of lavender, a small luxury from Red Cross supply packages. Several women wept during their first bath, not from pain, but from the forgotten sensation of being treated as human beings worthy of gentleness. One woman, identified in records only as Subject 7, because she never revealed her real name, touched the soap repeatedly as if it might disappear, then clutched it against her chest while she slept that first night. The beds were military cots with thin mattresses, nothing luxurious by American standards, but they had clean white sheets, laundered and smelling faintly of the disinfectant used to kill tropical pathogens. Each woman received her own bed, not a shared mat on a floor, not a cubicle where men came and went, but a bed in a row of beds, in a room guarded by soldiers whose orders were simple. No one enters except medical staff. The women didn't believe it at first. Several sat on the floor beside their cots, unable to accept that the bed was theirs alone. Others lay rigid, eyes open, waiting for the door to open and the nightmare to resume. It didn't. Food arrived 3 times a day. The Army mess served standard military rations, powdered eggs, reconstituted and scrambled, canned hash, bread with margarine, coffee with condensed milk. For soldiers, it was monotonous fare, barely tolerable. For the women, it was abundance beyond comprehension. The portions were enormous compared to the watery rice and vegetable scraps they'd subsisted on in the comfort stations. Lieutenant Stevenson noted, "They didn't know how to react. Some ate so fast they made themselves sick. Others just stared at their trays and cried. One girl kept asking through the translator if this was her punishment, if we were fattening her up before something worse happened. It took 3 days before she believed the food wasn't conditional. The meals became a symbolic threshold. In the comfort stations, food had been a tool of control. Inadequate rations kept the women weak and dependent. Occasional better meals were rewards for compliance or punishments for resistance. Now food arrived simply because it was mealtime, no conditions attached. Seconds were available. No one monitored how much they ate. A woman could refuse food entirely if she chose, and it would be offered again at the next meal without consequence. This simple reliability, this predictable rhythm of provision without coercion, began to crack the architecture of fear that had been built in their minds. But it was the silence at night that stunned them most profoundly. In the comfort stations, night was the worst time. That was when the lines of soldiers were longest, when drunken officers arrived, when resistance was most brutally punished. The sounds were constant and inescapable. Boots on wooden floors, doors sliding open, voices giving orders or grunting with exertion, the muffled crying of other women, the creak of thin walls. Sleep was fractured and shallow, always interrupted. The body learned to exist in a state of permanent tension, waiting for the next violation. In the field hospital, night brought silence. Guards stood outside the building, but they stayed outside. The doors remained closed. The only sounds were the ordinary noises of people sleeping, soft breathing, the rustle of sheets, an occasional cough. No boots, no doors, no men. The women lay in their cots in the darkness, and the silence was so alien they couldn't trust it. Some waited all night for it to break, muscles tensed, expecting the familiar horror to return. Others wept quietly, overwhelmed by the absence of violence. A few slept for 12, 14, 16 hours straight, their exhausted bodies finally surrendering to a rest they had been denied for months or years. Lieutenant Stevenson's letters capture the gradual shift. By the 4th day, some of them started to relax. You could see it in their faces, still wary, still frightened, but something had changed. They began to talk to each other in quiet voices. A couple of the younger girls even smiled when one of the nurses brought them clean clothes. It's like they were remembering that it's possible to be a person, not just a thing that gets used. The American soldiers and medical staff who provided this care operated within their own cultural and ideological framework. The United States in 1945 was a nation deeply invested in a narrative of its war as a crusade against barbarism and tyranny. Propaganda films, radio broadcasts, and newsreels emphasized the stark moral contrast between American values, freedom, democracy, human dignity, and the cruelty of Axis powers. This narrative served strategic purposes, maintaining morale and justifying the enormous sacrifices of war. But it also shaped how American personnel understood and responded to the evidence of atrocity they encountered. When confronted with the reality of comfort stations, American service members saw confirmation of everything they'd been told about the enemy's inhumanity. But they also saw an opportunity to demonstrate what they believed America represented: a nation that protected the vulnerable, that treated even enemy civilians with a baseline of human decency, that valued individual dignity over brutal pragmatism. The clean beds, hot meals, and safe nights were not calculated propaganda. They were simply standard protocol for displaced civilian care. But to the women receiving that care, the contrast was shattering. Maria Rosa Henson, a Filipino woman who was enslaved in a comfort station near Manila, and later became one of the first to publicly testify about her experiences, wrote in her 1996 memoir about her time in American custody after liberation. I could not understand why they were kind. I'd been taught to expect torture. Instead, they gave me medicine. They gave me food. They called me ma'am. I was 14 years old, and I had forgotten that anyone could speak to me without demanding something from my body. That first week, I kept thinking it was a trick, that they would suddenly change and become like the Japanese soldiers. But they never did, even when I screamed at them or refused to eat or tried to run away. They just waited patiently and kept being kind. It confused me more than the violence had. This confusion, this cognitive dissonance between expectation and reality, was not peripheral to the women's experience. It was central. They had been systematically dehumanized, reduced to objects for others' use, and told that this was the natural order, that all men and all armies would treat them the same way. The Japanese military's narrative had prepared them for American cruelty, specifically because cruelty was the only treatment they had known. When kindness arrived instead, it forced a fundamental recalibration of their understanding of what human beings were capable of doing to each other. The symbolic weight of material abundance, the food, the clean linens, the soap, the medical supplies, extended beyond immediate physical comfort. These items represented a society capable of provisioning its forces so thoroughly that it could extend care even to enemy civilians who served no strategic value. A Japanese private stationed in the Philippines in early 1945, captured by American forces and later interviewed for military intelligence reports, expressed astonishment at American logistics. We were starving. We had not received supplies in months. Our uniforms were rags. And then we see American soldiers, and they have everything: food, vehicles, new weapons, medicine, even cigarettes and candy. They throw away things we would have fought over. How can you defeat an enemy who has so much that he can afford to be generous? This material abundance was inseparable from ideology. The United States' industrial capacity, its ability to mobilize resources on a continental scale, was a product of economic and political systems that, however imperfect, allowed for innovation, large-scale coordination, and voluntary cooperation. When comfort women encountered American plenty, when they saw that soldiers could afford to give away rations, that hospitals had medicine to spare, that clean clothes were routinely available, they were encountering the material manifestation of a different way of organizing society. The clean white sheets became a recurring symbol in the testimonies of survivors. In Korean, the phrase hayan shimul shaken white sheets appeared again and again in interviews conducted decades later by historians and advocates. The sheets represented not luxury, but the possibility of cleanliness, of starting over, of sleeping without dread. They were also distinctly American in their institutional blandness, mass-produced, standardized, distributed by the thousands to field hospitals across the Pacific. They were democracy rendered in cotton, functional, impersonal, but available to everyone. One survivor, Kim Hak-sun, who became the first Korean comfort woman to publicly testify in 1991, described in an oral history recorded by Seoul National University researchers her first night in an American medical facility in Okinawa. The nurse gave me white sheets. I didn't want to lie on them because I felt too dirty. I thought I would ruin them. I had not slept on anything white in 3 years. White meant purity, and I believed I had none left. But the nurse, she didn't speak Korean, but she understood. She helped me into the bed herself, and she tucked the sheets around me like I was a child. I cried all night, not from sadness, but because I remembered my mother doing the same thing when I was small, before the men came to our village. The sheets reminded me that I had once been someone's daughter, someone who deserved to sleep in a clean bed. The hot food carried similar symbolic weight. Army nutritionists had calculated caloric needs for soldiers in tropical combat, roughly 4,000 calories per day, to offset the physical demands of fighting in heat and humidity. Displaced civilians received smaller but still substantial portions designed to restore health to malnourished populations. The food was often unappetizing: corned beef hash from cans, dehydrated vegetables, bread that stayed mysteriously fresh for weeks, but it was reliable and plentiful. More importantly, it came without strings attached. This was the detail that many survivors emphasized most: the absence of conditions. In the comfort stations, every basic need had been weaponized. Food was scarce and used as reward or punishment. Water for washing was rationed. Medical care was contingent on continued service. Everything reinforced the message that survival depended on submission. In American custody, needs were met as a matter of protocol, not favor. A woman could be angry, uncooperative, even hostile, and still receive meals and medical treatment. This unconditional provision of basic dignity was, for many, the first crack in the psychological prison their captors had built. The silence at night remained the most powerful transformation. Sound, or its absence, carries profound psychological weight. The constant noise of the comfort stations had prevented rest, reflection, or any sense of privacy. Women existed in a state of enforced publicness, their bodies and suffering always available to be consumed. Silence, by contrast, created space for interiority, for the slow and painful process of remembering that they were individuals with inner lives that belonged to themselves. Captain Robert Meyer, a psychiatrist assigned to assess displaced civilians for repatriation processing, wrote in a 1945 report submitted to Army headquarters, "The most consistent symptom among the former comfort station occupants is hypervigilance, particularly at night. They startle at any sound. Many report being unable to sleep despite obvious exhaustion. Paradoxically, once they adjust to the safety of the hospital environment, many experience a flood of delayed psychological reactions, crying episodes, nightmares, episodes of dissociation. It is as if the absence of immediate threat allows the accumulated trauma to surface. We must understand that for these women, safety itself is traumatic because it is unfamiliar. Meyer's clinical language captures something essential. The women were stunned not only by the material conditions of American care, but by the psychological space that care created. They had survived by numbing themselves, by dissociating, by reducing their existence to the minimum necessary to endure. Safety forced them to feel again, and what they felt first was the enormity of what had been stolen from them. The American response to liberated comfort women was neither uniform nor without failure. Military records reveal significant inconsistencies in how different units handled these encounters. Some commanders, like Colonel Aubrey Newman of the 34th Infantry, established clear protocols: immediate evacuation to medical facilities, documentation of testimonies through interpreters, coordination with Red Cross and civilian relief agencies. Others, operating in the chaos of rapid advance and under-resourced conditions, provided minimal assistance or failed to recognize the women's status as victims rather than camp followers. Race complicated the American response in ways that reveal the contradictions of the liberating force. While white American soldiers and medical staff generally treated the women with professional compassion, there were troubling exceptions. A few documented cases exist of sexual assault by American personnel against comfort women after liberation, crimes that were prosecuted when discovered, but which nonetheless underscore that the capacity for violence crossed ideological lines. Additionally, racial prejudices of the era meant that Asian women were sometimes viewed through dehumanizing stereotypes, their victimization made invisible by assumptions about cultural difference or sexual availability. Yet, despite these failures, the overall pattern held. Most comfort women who came into American custody received care that stood in stark contrast to their treatment by Japanese forces. This was partly due to military discipline and protocol, but it also reflected the influence of female nurses and Red Cross workers who served as crucial advocates. Women like Lieutenant Stevenson, who wrote impassioned letters to her commanding officers demanding better provisions for the survivors, or Captain Francis Slanger, an Army nurse who died at Anzio, but whose philosophy of care influenced a generation of military medical personnel, shaped how the military responded to female victims of war. The broader American public remained largely unaware of the comfort women system during the war itself. Censorship and the focus on combat operations meant that detailed accounts of sexual slavery rarely reached newspapers. When information did surface, it was often sanitized or subsumed into general narratives of Japanese atrocity. It would not be until the 1990s, when survivors began speaking publicly and demanding recognition, that the full scope of the system entered historical consciousness. But for the women themselves, historical recognition was decades away. In 1945, they faced immediate questions of survival and future. Where would they go? Could they return home? Or would the shame, the culturally constructed shame of sexual violation, make that impossible? Would their families accept them? Would they ever be able to form relationships, have children, live normal lives? The American military's answer was limited but real. Transportation to their regions of origin when possible, small amounts of financial assistance, and letters documenting their civilian status to help with repatriation. It was bureaucratic and insufficient, but it was also unprecedented, recognition that these women deserved help rather than further exploitation. A single object mentioned in multiple survivor testimonies serves as an unexpected symbol of this transformative encounter: the coffee cup. Army mess kits included metal cups for hot beverages, and field hospitals served coffee freely throughout the day. For the comfort women, many of whom had never tasted coffee before, the drink itself was strange and often unpleasant bitter, strong, foreign, but the cup, refilled without limit, offered at regular intervals by nurses who treated the act as ordinary hospitality, became a marker of their changed status. In the comfort stations, women drank when water was available from shared containers in whatever moments they could steal between the lines of soldiers. They were never offered anything. They scavenged or went without. The coffee cup, by contrast, was presented to them. They could accept or refuse. They could drink quickly or slowly. They could ask for more. The cup represented choice, agency, and the simple social contract of hospitality. I offer, you decide, and your decision is respected. Kim Sun-ok is a Korean survivor who settled in Japan after the war and kept her past hidden until shortly before her death in 2004, told an interviewer about the coffee, "I hated the taste. It was too bitter, but I would drink it anyway because it was hot and because the nurse would smile when she poured it, like she was happy to do something nice for me. I had forgotten that faces could look like that when they approached me, happy instead of hungry. I kept the cup next to my bed even when it was empty. It felt like proof that I was still a person who could be offered something." The recurring motif of American abundance in these testimonies was not about luxury, but about baseline dignity extended as a norm rather than an exception. The comfort women had existed in a state of manufactured scarcity of food, of safety, of kindness, designed to break their will and erase their humanity. American material culture, with its mass-produced goods and logistical plenty, dissolved that scarcity. The abundance was ideological as much as material. It suggested a world where there was enough for everyone, where kindness was not a finite resource to be hoarded, where a person's worth was not measured by their usefulness to power. This abundance was, of course, selective and conditional. The United States in 1945 was a deeply flawed democracy, racially segregated, economically unequal, willing to intern its own citizens based on ethnicity. The same industrial capacity that fed comfort women in field hospitals had produced the firebombs that incinerated Japanese cities and would soon deploy atomic weapons against civilian populations. Moral purity was absent on all sides of the war. But for the individual women lying in those clean beds, eating those hot meals, sleeping through those silent nights, the comparison was personal and immediate. They measured American treatment not against an abstract ethical standard, but against their lived experience of Japanese military slavery. And by that measure, the contrast was absolute. The long-term psychological impact of this contrast shaped survivors' lives in complex ways. And many struggled with what psychologists now recognize as trauma bonding and moral injury. The mind struggled to reconcile what was endured with what was discovered about human possibility. If kindness existed, why had they been denied it for so long? If clean beds and hot food were so easily provided, why had they been starved and degraded? The answers required understanding systems of power, ideology, and dehumanization that few had the framework to process. Some survivors interpreted their treatment by Americans through religious frameworks. Christianity, particularly Catholicism, had significant presence in Korea and the Philippines, and some women understood their rescue as divine intervention, proof that God had not abandoned them despite their suffering. Others rejected religious meaning entirely, finding no comfort in faith that had not protected them when they needed it most. A few survivors eventually married American servicemen and immigrated to the United States, relationships that were sometimes genuine love and sometimes pragmatic escapes from societies that stigmatized them. These women lived complicated lives, often hiding their pasts from their new communities, raising children in suburban America while carrying memories that had no vocabulary in their adopted language. Their experiences of American society, its prosperity and racism, its democratic ideals and social exclusions, added further layers to their understanding of the nation that had first offered them clean beds and silence. Most survivors, however, returned to their countries of origin and lived in silence. Korea, deeply influenced by Confucian values that equated female sexual purity with family honor, offered little support and much shame. Women who revealed what had happened to them were often ostracized by their own families. Many never married, fearing exposure or unable to trust intimacy. They worked in factories as domestic servants, as street vendors, lives of quiet survival, the trauma carried privately. It would take 46 years after the war's end for the first Korean comfort woman to speak publicly, and her testimony would open the floodgates for thousands of others who had carried their stories in silence for nearly half a century. The Japanese government's response to these revelations was marked by decades of denial, grudging acknowledgement, and contentious debates over legal responsibility and compensation. Official apologies came late and were often undermined by subsequent statements from politicians questioning the testimonies. The Kono Statement of 1993 acknowledged military involvement in coercing women, but stopped short of accepting full legal responsibility. The Asian Women's Fund, established in 1995, offered private donations rather than official reparations, a compromise that many survivors rejected as insufficient recognition of state crimes. These bureaucratic and political battles over memory and justice unfolded in conference rooms and courtrooms, far removed from the field hospital in Luzon, where 23 women once slept in clean beds and woke to silence. Yet they were connected by a single thread: the question of what societies owe to the people they brutalize, and whether acknowledgement, even decades late, can constitute a form of repair. There is a photograph in the National Archives taken in February 1945 at a displaced persons facility in Leyte. It shows a row of women sitting on wooden benches in the sun, their faces turned toward the camera, but not meeting its lens. They wear mismatched clothing, army fatigue shirts too large for their frames, donated civilian dresses, canvas shoes. Their hair is clean and tied back. Their hands rest in their laps. They are waiting for processing, for transportation, for whatever comes next. The photograph is labeled only with a date and location. The women's names were not recorded, or if they were, the records have been lost. But in their anonymous faces is written a truth that echoes across 8 decades, that dignity is not a luxury, but a fundamental human need, that its absence can break a person as surely as violence can, and that its restoration, even partial, even temporary, can crack open possibilities that seemed forever closed. The clean beds, the hot food, the silence at night, these were not grand gestures. They were basic provisions, standard protocols, the minimum requirements of humanitarian care. That they stunned the comfort women says everything about the depths of cruelty they had endured, and nothing about the virtue of their liberators. Americans provided what they would have provided to any displaced civilians, because that was the policy. There was no special moral insight involved, no exceptional compassion. It was simply what institutions committed to human rights, however imperfectly, did as a matter of course. And yet the contrast mattered. It shattered the narrative the women had been taught, that all men were predators, that all soldiers were the same, that suffering was inevitable and resistance pointless. It proved that systems of care could exist, that societies could choose to organize themselves around principles other than domination and exploitation. This knowledge was both gift and burden. It gave survivors something to hold on to during the long decades of silence and stigma that followed. But it also raised agonizing questions about why such care was withheld in the first place, why some nations chose to systematize brutality while others at least gestured toward mercy. The coffee cup, the white sheets, the uneaten portions of hash and powdered eggs, these mundane objects became vessels for an unbearable truth, that the horrors inflicted on the comfort women were not inevitable features of war, but deliberate choices made by human institutions. And if they were choices, then they could have been different choices. The women had been taught that their suffering was natural, that this was what women endured, that resistance was futile. The silence at night, the absence of boots on floorboards, the nurses who smiled instead of demanded, these proved that teaching was a lie. Not all lies are equal. Some lies are told to make atrocity possible. Others are told to make survival bearable. The comfort women lived through both, and when they finally began to speak in the 1990s, their testimonies carried the weight of decades spent navigating between them. They had been silent not because they accepted what happened, but because the world was not ready to hear, because their societies punished victims rather than perpetrators, because speaking meant reliving and reliving meant drowning. But silence has its own weight, and eventually it became heavier than speech. So they spoke, and the world heard about the clean beds and the hot food and the shocking, disorienting gift of nights without terror. They spoke about the Japanese military's systematic cruelty and the American soldiers who offered blankets instead of brutality. They spoke not to praise their liberators, but to indict their enslavers, to demand recognition of crimes that governments wanted to forget, to insist that their suffering mattered and their survival was testimony. The field hospital in Luzon is gone now, reclaimed by tropical growth or paved over by the expanding cities of a prosperous Philippines. The women who slept there are mostly gone too, their bodies surrendered to age and the accumulated damage of trauma that medicine could treat but not cure. But the story remains, not as propaganda or triumphalism, but as evidence of what happens when human beings are treated as objects and what begins to heal when they are treated as people. In the end, the comfort women were stunned by clean beds, hot food, and silence at night, not because these things were extraordinary, but because their absence had been weaponized so completely. They were stunned by the ordinary, by the baseline of human decency that should have been theirs all along. And in their stunned faces, captured and faded photographs, and decades later testimonies, we see reflected not just the cruelty they endured, but the possibilities they proved still existed, that even in history's darkest chapters, the choice to treat human beings with dignity remains available, waiting only for institutions and individuals brave enough to make it. That is the epilogue written in white sheets and coffee cups, in the silence of safe nights and the slowly returning ability to trust kindness. It is an epilogue about systems and choices, about what societies reveal through their treatment of the vulnerable, about the distance between what was done and what could have been done differently. It offers no redemption and demands no forgiveness. It simply testifies, this happened, this also happened, and the difference between them is the difference between hell and the first glimpse of something else. Not heaven, but perhaps the long, difficult road that might eventually lead there.